He won titles, thrilled crowds, fought like a man possessed. That was Bobby Chacon in the ring. But outside of it, his life was a storm of tragedy and chaos. From his wife's death before the fight of his life, the brutal murder of his son, and a never-ending battle with substance abuse, he lost almost everything. And by the time the 90s rolled around, the same man who once headlined championship bouts was seen digging through trash cans for spare change, unable to remember his own name. How does a legend end up like that? To understand how everything unraveled, we have to go back to the very beginning. Bobby Chacon's story begins with a contradiction. A young college kid with textbooks in one hand and boxing gloves in the other. Born in 1951 in Sylmar, California, he picked up the nickname Schoolboy while attending California State University, Northridge. He wasn't supposed to be a brawler. He was supposed to be the kid who made it out. Smart, clean-cut, the kind of guy you'd expect to become a teacher, not a human highlight reel in the ring. But the streets called louder than the classroom, and once he stepped into a gym, there was no turning back. Even early on, the contrast was striking. This wasn't your typical hungry prospect from a broken home. He had options. But instead of chasing a diploma, he chased knockouts. And he was good at it. Really good. He racked up wins at the Diamond Belt Championships, made waves at the National Golden Gloves, and looked destined for greatness. But even before his first pro fight, there were signs of trouble. A narcotics investigation by the California Athletic Commission nearly kept him from getting his amateur license. It was a warning shot, one that hinted at the chaos brewing beneath the surface. And as history would prove, Bobby Chacon was a man who could never quite outrun his demons. When he finally turned pro in 1972, it was like lighting a match. He tore through 23 of his first 25 opponents with knockouts so brutal they felt personal. But this wasn't just talent. It was showmanship. He loved the roar of the crowd more than the judges' scorecards. He ditched his technical style for toe-to-toe wars, and fans couldn't get enough. He wasn't just fighting opponents. He was fighting to feel alive. By 1974, he was riding high. He'd just claimed the WBC featherweight title after stopping Alfredo Marcano in 9 rounds at the Olympic Auditorium in Los Angeles. The crowd went wild. He was finally a world champion. It should have been the start of his golden era. But behind the celebration, a darker question lingered. Could Chacon handle the pressure that came with the crown? If we're being honest, he wasn't built for structure. Discipline was never his strong suit. His training habits were loose, his diet even looser. And the wild streak that made him so exciting in the ring was starting to sabotage him outside it. In 1975, the cracks in his foundation became impossible to ignore. He was set to defend his title against Ruben Olivares, a living legend and fierce rival. But the real opponent wasn't Olivares. It was the scale. He had to cut over 10 pounds in just days, pushing his body to the brink. By fight night, he was drained, and it showed. The result was brutal. Olivares bulldozed him in just 2 rounds. The aftermath was even worse. His bad cut weight left him so weakened that the California State Athletic Commission temporarily suspended his license. It was a jarring wake-up call. The whispers about his lack of discipline weren't just rumors anymore. They were facts, and they were starting to define him. Still, Bobby didn't fold. He came back with a win over Danny Lopez, another tough contender, stopping him in the 9th round. It was a win that reminded fans exactly why they loved him in the first place. He could take a beating, take a loss, and still come roaring back. That was his gift, and maybe his curse. Because for all his comebacks, there was always something fragile under the surface. The same wild energy that made him electrifying in the ring made him reckless outside of it. His life was a fuse, always burning, always just inches from the next explosion. His rise was fast, too fast. It wasn't built on the usual discipline or structure. It was built on instinct, adrenaline, and chaos barely held in check. Every big win came with a price. Every roar of the crowd masked something darker waiting at home. From the start, Bobby Chacon had been living in two worlds, the hero in the spotlight and the man unraveling in the shadows. And as the fights piled up, so did the damage. Because the greatest tragedy in his life wasn't a single moment. It was everything that led to it. Valerie Jin was more than just Bobby's high school sweetheart. She was his anchor, the person who stood by him from the start, watching as he transformed from a hopeful kid into a world champion. But as Bobby's career picked up speed, the risks and the pain that came with it started to weigh on her. She saw what the crowd didn't. The bruises that never fully healed, the slurred speech after tough fights, and the way Bobby pushed himself through every injury and setback. Valerie was watching the slow, painful erosion of the man she loved. She was only 31 when everything began to crack. Her concern was desperate. She begged him time and again to leave the ring behind. She wasn't asking him to give up. She was asking him to survive. Valerie knew exactly where this road led. She'd seen the old fighters, the ones who stayed in too long, stumbling through life half broken, half forgotten. And she didn't want that for him. She didn't want to watch the man she married become a ghost of himself. She couldn't stand it. She even flew to Hawaii at one point, desperate to pull him away from another fight. But it didn't matter. Bobby couldn't let go. The roar of the crowd, the adrenaline, the identity, it was all too strong. The ring had a hold on him that nothing else could break. And no matter how much she begged, he kept going back. He chose boxing, and the cost of that choice was coming fast. Everything came to a head the night before Bobby's scheduled fight against Salvador Ugalde, March 15, 1982. He wasn't in the gym or resting or doing interviews. He was on the phone with Valerie. Again. And this time, she was begging him not to go through with the fight, making one last wretched plea for him to walk away from the sport that was tearing their lives apart. She wasn't just emotional, she was desperate. According to family, she made it clear, walk away, come home, choose me over the ring. But Bobby couldn't, or wouldn't. Locked into his fighter's mindset, he told her he had to go through with it. Then the phone call ended. And so did something far more permanent. Just hours later, Valerie took her own life. She died the night before the fight, leaving behind a grief that would haunt him for the rest of his time. The news was a gut punch, one of those moments where time just stops. She was 31, a mother, a wife, and she was gone. Most assumed Bobby would cancel, pull out, grieve. But instead, in a move that still stuns people to this day, he fought. He stepped into the ring the very next night and knocked out Ugalde in the third round. To the outside world, it looked like courage, like focus, like some twisted proof that Bobby Chacon was built different. But it wasn't toughness. It was denial. Bobby later admitted, "The only thing I was afraid of was losing her." And when that fear became real, when the woman who begged him to choose life over legacy disappeared forever, he didn't cope. He buried it. He buried it deep, under cheers, under punches, under years of heartbreak. He focused on the only thing he knew, fighting. The fans saw a warrior that night. But the truth, that was the first round of a very different kind of fight, one Bobby never truly recovered from. The emotional crash didn't come right away. Bobby did what fighters do. He kept moving, kept training, kept throwing punches like maybe, just maybe, he could outrun the pain. But it caught him, and when it did, it came like a freight train. December 1982. His fourth and final war with Rafael Limon. A brutal, bloody 15-round war that left both men battered. He won that fight, but when the crowd left and the cameras shut off, something else hit him even harder. That night, the weight of Valerie's death finally broke through. He had survived in the ring, but the grief he'd tried to suppress came crashing down, leaving him raw, exposed, shattered. He'd been fighting with a ghost in his corner. Every round, every punch, haunted by the voice of the woman who begged him to stop. Valerie's death wasn't just a tragedy, it was the turning point. Bobby was never quite the same. The swagger remained. The fists still flew. But underneath, he was a man unraveling, carrying guilt, pain, and the memory of a phone call he couldn't undo. The public saw the knockouts and the comebacks, but they didn't see the nights he spent alone with his thoughts, replaying Valerie's final plea over and over. From that point forward, Bobby wasn't just fighting opponents, he was fighting himself. And no amount of belts or glory could save him from what was coming next. Because the chaos was just getting started. After Valerie's death, Bobby tried to start over. He remarried, this time to Melissa Chacon, maybe hoping a new beginning would help bury the past. But it didn't. Instead of bringing peace, the relationship became another source of turmoil. In October 1984, the chaos boiled over. Bobby was placed on probation for beating Melissa so badly that she ended up with 2 broken ribs, severe cuts, and bruises all over her body. This wasn't just another domestic dispute. It was a violent episode that showed just how far things had unraveled. The details were public, and suddenly, the image of the gutsy, crowd-pleasing fighter was replaced by headlines about violence and abuse. And things kept getting worse. By April 1985, Chacon was back in front of a judge, this time for DUI and marijuana possession. It was clear these weren't isolated slip-ups. They were signs of a man losing his grip in plain sight. Each arrest, each courtroom appearance chipped away at his legacy until there was almost nothing left but tabloid shame. Then came the final blow. By July 1986, the California Athletic Commission had seen enough. They suspended his boxing license indefinitely for bringing discredit to boxing. That phrase, cold, official, masked something much deeper. Boxing was abandoning him. It was like losing his last lifeline. Boxing had always been the one thing that grounded him, that had kept him from completely falling apart. Now, even that was gone. And without boxing, Bobby had nothing left to hold on to. His battles with addiction exploded. Drinking had always been part of his life, even during his championship years. But after his license was stripped and his personal life fell apart, he spiraled. Crack cocaine entered the picture, and with it came the final descent into self-destruction. Every attempt to get back on track seemed to be met with another setback, and every new low made it harder to climb out. But nothing prepared him for what happened on October 4th, 1991. His 17-year-old son, Bobby Chacon Jr., was gunned down in a gang-related shooting in a San Fernando Valley Mall parking lot. It started as a petty argument between gangs and ended with a bullet in his son's chest. He had already lost so much, but the death of his son cut deeper than anything he'd faced before. For Bobby, it was more than heartbreak. It was devastation. A pain so deep that even his closest friends said he was never the same again. And how could he be? After that night, Bobby wasn't fighting to survive anymore. He was just running from the grief, from the guilt, from everything. Crack became a crutch, then a cage. He was no longer the wild, charismatic showman who made crowds roar. He was broken, hiding from memories that wouldn't let him breathe, caught in a cycle that only seemed to get worse. This was no longer a fall from grace. It was a total collapse. And the worst part? No one seemed able to stop it. By the early 1990s, his days as a world champion felt like a distant memory. The violence, the loss, and the addiction had left him isolated and struggling, with each new tragedy piling onto the last. Gone was the schoolboy charm. Gone was the champion. What remained was a man hollowed out by grief and the slow erosion of everything he once stood for. The violence he once dished out in the ring had followed him home and multiplied. His body was battered, his mind fading. The years of punishment inside and outside the ropes had begun to show. He wasn't just losing control of his life, he was losing himself. What came next was less of a fall and more of a slow disappearance. Fame, fortune, health, all gone, and no one could stop the slide. In his prime, Bobby Chacon packed arenas and delivered the kind of fights people still talk about decades later. He wasn't just a champion, he was a showman. His blood and guts style was the kind that earned him not one but 2 Ring Magazine Fight of the Year awards. He could have danced around his opponents. He had the skill, but he chose to stand and trade, round after brutal round. "I just loved hearing that crowd yell," he once said. That roar, the validation, the addiction, meant more to him than safety, more than longevity, maybe even more than his own future. But with every one of those standing ovations, something inside him slipped. He racked up 59 wins, but they came at a cost no one saw until it was too late. His words began to slur. His memory started to vanish. He'd look dazed at times, even in victory. It wasn't just wear and tear, it was neurological collapse. The telltale signs of pugilistic dementia, or CTE. The very style that made him a star was quietly killing him. Financial disaster wasn't far behind. His earnings from years at the top of the sport should have set him up for life. He should have had a house, a car, maybe even peace. Instead, he lost everything. The mansion, gone. The farmland, the Rolls Royces, the glory, all stripped away piece by piece. By the 1990s, he was living in a transient motel, scraping by however he could. The stories of him scavenging cans for recycling weren't tabloid exaggerations. They were real. That was how a man who once headlined in Las Vegas ended up searching for loose change just to eat. Behind the scenes, crack cocaine had taken hold. And with his brain already damaged from years of punishment in the ring, his grip on reality began to fade. CTE clouded his thoughts. The drugs made it worse. Substance abuse isolated him from friends and family, made his legal and financial troubles worse, and left him with almost nothing. If you saw him in those later years, you wouldn't have recognized the fighter who once brought crowds to their feet. He could barely string together a sentence. Sometimes he didn't even know where he was. Back then it was called the price of being a warrior. Repeated blows to the head, fight after fight, war after war, left Bobby broken in ways no crowd ever saw. Depression, impulse control, outbursts, addiction. That wasn't a coincidence. That was the cost, and Bobby paid it in full. The contrast is hard to shake. There was the young schoolboy, arms raised in victory, and then the old man, alone and diminished, his legacy overshadowed by tragedy. By his 60s, he was frail and dependent, a far cry from the champion who once seemed invincible. The same fans who once roared for his bravery could only watch, helpless, as he faded into silence. But the story doesn't end there. Bobby's rise and fall still haunt the sport that built him and broke him. His triumphs were unforgettable, but so was the pain. And in that tension, we're left with the question boxing never wants to answer. Is the price of glory ever worth it? The final chapter of his life is a stark portrait of both what he achieved and what it cost him. On September 7, 2016, he died at age 64 in Lake Elsinore, California, under hospice care for dementia. The cause was brain damage, years of punishment in the ring catching up with him. He spent his final days with family, but the absence of others, his wife Valerie, his son Bobby Jr., hung heavy over the room. The blows that made him famous ultimately took everything: his health, his memories, and finally his life. He survived Valerie's final plea, but never recovered from her death or from his son's murder. The violence that plagued his later years didn't start at home. It started in the ring. With every brutal round, he refused to quit. That's the hard truth of Chacon's legacy. The glory and the pain were one and the same. But his story isn't only about loss. He made his mark with a reckless, fearless style that thrilled fans and terrified opponents. He held the WBC featherweight title from 1974 to 1975 and the super featherweight title from 1982 to 1983. He fought the best in 3 weight classes, never ducked a challenge, and gave fans 2 Ring Magazine Fight of the Year performances. In 2005, he was inducted into the International Boxing Hall of Fame, not just for his titles, but for the way he fought, the blood he spilled, and the heart he gave every time he stepped into the ring. Still, it's impossible to celebrate his achievements without feeling the full weight of what he endured. His decline was slow, painful, and painfully public. The dementia that claimed his mind has haunted countless boxers. By the end, Chacon was a shell of the man he once was, stripped of memories, speech, and self. He became living proof of what boxing can take from its heroes. His story became a warning as much as a celebration. For every champion who lifts a belt in victory, there's a risk that the same courage will one day leave them broken. Poet Eloisa Amezcua captured this duality in her collection, Fighting is Like a Wife, calling Chacon's world a cyclic sort of hell, where anguish, love, loneliness, and violence endlessly collided. She understood that for Bobby, fighting wasn't something you walked away from. It followed him everywhere, into his relationships, his addictions, his heartbreak. It shaped not just his career, but his very soul. Ask anyone who saw him fight, and they'll tell you, Bobby Chacon was unforgettable, but glory comes at a cost, and sometimes it takes everything. What do you think? What's the price of glory when the road to it destroys the man walking it? Could his wife's death have been prevented? If he had just listened? Let us know in the comments which part of his journey shocked you the most. And if his story moved you, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the triumphs and tragedies of boxing's greatest legends. See you in the next one.